You're standing in a place where the sun barely rises, and when it does, it casts no warmth. The earth beneath your feet is frozen solid. Your breath clouds in the air like smoke from a dying fire. And you are thirsty. Not grab a bottle thirsty. Not skip a coffee thirsty. You are ancient world thirsty. The kind where your body starts to slow, your vision fades, and your tribe's survival depends on whether you can find liquid life under a world of ice. There is no snowmelt stream, no rainfall, no obvious clue, just layers of permafrost and rock stretching deep below your calloused feet. And yet somehow you know what to do. You begin to walk. There's something in the wind, a glint in the terrain, the echo of mammoth herds, the old marks in the lichen, and beneath the surface moisture, barely perceptible, but you sense it, somehow. How? This is the secret modern science almost forgot. How did prehistoric humans, with no tools, no maps, no data, locate and access water trapped beneath frozen, hostile earth? And what does it reveal about you, your ancestors, and what we might be forced to relearn in a world facing its own slow freeze? You wake to silence, not the soft silence of modern comfort, no hum of electricity, no distant murmur of traffic, but a silence so absolute it presses against your skin like a second atmosphere. The world around you is frozen in every direction, buried under ice, wind, and time. The sun is a dull smudge in a sky the color of bone, barely rising before it slips again beneath the edge of the world. Light exists, but warmth does not. Your breath crystallizes instantly. Every inhale sears your lungs with cold so sharp it feels like glass. Every exhale reminds you that you're still alive, but only just. You shift beneath layers of animal hide, cracked leather, and bone-threaded fur, and already you feel it again. The ache, the weight, the gnawing hollowness that isn't hunger. It's thirst. You have not had clean water in 2 days. Not since the last melt pocket vanished, not since the stream beneath the ridge froze solid and disappeared beneath 6 feet of ice and sediment. Your body is slowing. Thoughts come slower. Joints stiffen. And you know even if the body could survive without food, it cannot last without water. Not here. Not now. Around you others stir. Some cough. Some don't move. Eyes meet yours, hollow and tired. One child has cracked lips that bleed with every word. Another rubs frostbite from her fingertips as if she can will the blood back into them. But they all wait. For you. Because you're the one who's supposed to find it. The water. But how? There's no stream to follow. No rainfall. No trickle over stone. The world has withdrawn its mercy. The land is a vault of locked earth and shifting ice. It holds what you need, but it will not give it freely. And you have no maps, no instruments, no metals, just instincts, memory, pattern, and cold. You stand. Your body protests. Your knees creak like ancient trees. Every motion feels wrong. Even your blood is slow. But you move forward toward the edge of camp, toward the white expanse that never seems to end. The glacial plain stretches before you like a cracked mirror. Underneath it, somewhere, somehow, is life. But where do you begin? The wind bites harder as you step away from shelter. It finds the seams in your clothing, the cracks in your skin. It whispers with voices you almost recognize, not words, but something older. something your ancestors once understood. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. Really listen. There are no signs, no landmarks, no flowing water, and yet you've seen it before. The way certain snow settles differently, the color of lichen near certain stones, the patterns animals carve with their feet as they walk, as if they're following something you can't yet see. It isn't certainty you feel, it's something else. A tension, a pull, like a string deep in your chest being tugged toward something buried. And this is what the world has forgotten. You were never just a brute with a club. You were a sensor, a scientist, a survivalist. Your ancestors watched the wind for shifts in scent, felt the ground for subtle warmth, noticed when moss grew thicker in places no sun touched. They knew that water, even in a frozen hell, leaves clues. And now, with every step you take, those instincts are waking up again. You descend toward a shallow depression, ringed by jagged stone and broken branches. To anyone else it looks unremarkable, but you remember this shape. In warmer times this was where meltwater pooled, not on the surface but underground. The terrain tells you the permafrost here is thinner, fractured by roots, by time. You kneel, press your hand to the soil, wait. At first, nothing. Then wetness. Not a trickle, not even a drop, just a shift in temperature, a sense of dampness beneath the crust. You don't know the science of thermodynamics or capillary action or glacial insulation, but you know what it feels like when the earth is hiding something. You know when to dig, and this is one of those times. You return to camp, gather others. Not all can move. Some stay curled, hopping for sleep. But those who follow bring tools, if you can call them that. Sharpened stones, fire-warmed bones, leather straps. The beginnings of what, thousands of years from now, someone might call early hydrology. You begin to dig. Not wildly, not deep, carefully, with memory guiding you. You build a small fire over the spot, feeding it with what little wood you have, using heat to soften the layers. You carve downward, inch by inch, and soon steam rises, the soil darkens. Fingers reach in, scraping, testing. Then a drop. It's enough to stop time. One drop, cold, dirty, real. You taste it and it hits your tongue like salvation. Not clean, not safe, but alive. You pass the skin to the next hands. They sip. Someone weeps. You don't speak. You simply keep working. Because this is not the last time the water will vanish. It will freeze again. It will hide. It will turn against you in floods or poison you with rot. But for now, you've won. And yet, deep down, you know something else. You didn't just find water, you found a method, a ritual, a pattern you'll return to, one your children will learn, one that will be passed down for thousands of years. Not as science, not yet, but as myth, song, and memory. A kind of knowledge that survives longer than stone. But that comes later. For now, you drink. And tomorrow, you walk further because this patch won't last forever. You'll have to go where even fewer signs exist, where the ice is thicker, where your instincts are all you have left. And the question begins to grow in your mind. How do you find water when even the sky forgets it ever rained? The change didn't happen in a single night, but it might as well have. One day you knew the sound of rain, that scattered hiss against stretched hide, the promise of water filling basins and cracks, nourishing roots that slept under soil. You knew rivers, too wide, roaring, loud enough to drown out thought when they swelled in spring. You knew meltwater, snowdrifts that slowly bled into the land with the returning sun. That world is gone now. You wake each morning to the same brittle stillness. The snow remains untouched, hard, glassy. It doesn't melt, it just accumulates, thickens, layer upon layer of white that no longer turns to slush but compresses into something crueler, ice that never goes away. You've stopped expecting rain. Even the clouds don't behave like they used to. They float too high. They pass overhead like ghosts, casting shadows that promise relief but bring nothing. You still catch yourself scanning the sky for signs, for breaks in the cloud cover, for warm winds that might stir the old rhythms back into motion. But the sky has forgotten you. It has closed itself off, turned from ally to traitor. You feel it in your body, the dull headaches, the cracks in your lips that won't heal, the dryness behind your eyes. Every breath you take carries dust, not moisture. The world isn't just cold, it's dry, painfully, terrifyingly dry. And when you finally stumble across the stream, the one your grandfather once showed you, the one that fed your camp for generations, it's frozen solid. Not just crusted with frost, not a skim of ice. It's entombed, locked beneath layers of ancient frost so thick you can't even see the bedrock. What once flowed now shatters under your heel like glass. You kneel beside it, press your hand against the surface, hopping for warmth, for vibration, for any sign that life still stirs below. But there's nothing, not a sound, not a pulse, only the silence of something long dead. You look around and realize the entire valley has been arrested in place. Time has stopped. Movement has ceased. You are alone in a paused world. And that's when the truth begins to bloom, slow and uncomfortable in your mind. The surface has failed you. Rain will not return. Rivers cannot be trusted. Snow is no longer a source of life but a veil that hides everything you once relied on. And the lakes, the beautiful, shallow lakes where animals once gathered, where fish once danced beneath moonlight, they've vanished, evaporated, drained, or worse, buried under layers of wind-driven dust and glacial drift. What you see on the surface is no longer reality. It's a mask, a lie. You cannot look up anymore. You must look down. But where? How do you begin to see what's buried? You've never had tools like sonar or satellite imaging. No deep drills or seismic readouts. You are the probe. You are the radar. Your body becomes the tool, and it starts with noticing what others miss. You begin to study the land differently now, not for signs of prey, but for depressions that hold heat longer than others. You track the animals more carefully, not just where they walk, but where they pause, where their breath fogs heavier, where they dig. You watch where fog rises in early dawns, where frost melts sooner, where the snow crust breaks more easily. Patterns emerge, subtle at first, then persistent. Sometimes it's the presence of certain plants. Even in the cold, life finds ways to cling to edges of the possible. A cluster of tough moss along a rock face, a vine that curls along a half-buried stone. Life cheats. It follows moisture wherever it finds it. And if something green has survived, even in miniature, it means water is nearby, not flowing, but trapped, hidden. So you begin to map these signs in your memory. You stop chasing the visible and begin decoding the invisible. And that shift from sky to soil becomes your salvation. But it's not just where to look, it's how to listen. Some nights you lie flat against the ground, not to sleep, to feel. You place your cheek against the earth and close your eyes. You listen to the vibration of wind against stones. You try to catch subtle differences, the way footsteps sound different when the ground is hollow beneath layers of snow, how the air smells in different hollows. Sometimes there's a kind of sweetness in the cold, a scent you can't name, but you've learned to follow. It leads you somewhere softer, wetter. You speak less now. Your tribe watches you in silence, trusting something they don't understand. And slowly, slowly, the old ways of reading the land return to you, not as memories, but as instincts. You become the kind of human that modern ones have forgotten existed, one who could find water without ever seeing it. But make no mistake, the work is brutal. You dig and dig and dig and still find nothing half the time. Your hands crack. The cold numbs your fingertips until you can't feel the stone you're scraping with. Some holes reveal only dry frost, others collapse. But then one morning you strike something soft, not soil, not ice, a membrane of wet sand. Beneath it, the echo of a drip. And that one moment justifies everything. You wait. You warm the area with fire. You dig further. You carve a channel with bone tools. And finally, water seeps upward, slow, reluctant, but present, not flowing, not generous, but real, enough to fill a skin bladder, enough to sip, enough to live. You drink carefully, reverently. The others wait their turn. No one gulps, no one wastes, because everyone knows now what you've come to understand. The earth holds secrets, but only for those willing to read its language. You've left behind the sky, the rivers, the surface myths of water that flows freely and cleanly. You've entered a different world now, a hidden one where water is no longer a gift but a conquest. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a darker thought takes root. What if someday, even this underground supply dries up? But you don't say it aloud. You drink, you survive, you prepare to move again. Because now that the sky has betrayed you, your only hope is to go deeper, into the frozen bones of the earth. And what lies there is older, more dangerous, and more precious than you ever imagined. You don't have instruments, no copper coils, no lenses, no seismographs to tell you what lies beneath the surface. All you have are your eyes, your skin, your instincts, and the quiet accumulation of memory. But in this world, that's not nothing. That's everything. Because when survival becomes ritual, the mind sharpens. You stop seeing the landscape as a blur of white and stone. You begin to notice what doesn't belong. A patch of earth where snow melts faster. A line of animal tracks that repeats itself season after season. A cluster of dried berries growing in a shape that feels too intentional. And over time it clicks. These things aren't accidents, they're clues. You realize that the bones tell stories first, not just the ones you carve into tools or stack for windbreaks, the ones you find scattered across the tundra. A ribcage half buried in snow, antlers tangled in roots, a skull picked clean and left beside a hollow. These aren't just remnants of death. They are coordinates, because death, like water, has patterns. Where the carcasses pile up, that's where life once gathered. Animals don't die just anywhere. They die where they return again and again. And they return to water. Even in the coldest age, when nothing flows and everything freezes, thirst brings them back to the same invisible places. So you begin to map death. You build your own mental cartography, a living archive of where wolves drag their prey, where birds circle longer than usual, where the air smells more coppery, more rotten, more alive. You walk past bones you used to ignore and now see them as footprints of what was once liquid. You begin to dig where the skeletons linger. And more often than not, you find dampness. But bones are only part of the language. Plants speak too. You've seen the difference. In some hollows, the moss grows thicker. In others, it's brittle, gray, barely clinging to stone. You notice how certain berries cluster around low-lying rock as if cradling some invisible warmth. These aren't coincidences. Roots know what you're just beginning to learn. Even beneath the frozen surface, water moves. Not as rivers, not as streams, as whispers. Subsurface trickles that seep along fault lines, collecting in pockets just deep enough to feed roots without breaking the surface. The plants are listening, and if you want to survive, you need to listen too. You begin experimenting, not by choice but necessity. Each day without water pushes you into more creative observation. You crush berries in your fingers to feel their moisture. You scrape bark and chew it, tasting for signs of sap, for the subtle difference between life and drought. You press your hands into moss to feel its pulse. And without realizing it, you are becoming something else. Not just a survivor, a pattern finder, a proto-scientist. Not because you're smarter than others, but because desperation has forced you to become more sensitive. Your brain begins to knit together observations into principles, not in words, not yet, but in behaviors. You learn, through repetition, what to trust and what to doubt, that a slope facing the morning sun thaws first, that depressions near certain shrubs never seem fully dry, that some plants only grow where ice hides just below the crust. You don't write any of this down. You pass it through story, gesture, example. You show others where to kneel, where to dig, where to taste the mud. You say things like, "This place smells warmer," or "The snow here has weight." And even though the words sound strange, everyone understands, because your body now carries knowledge that language hasn't caught up to. And then comes the test. One morning, a young boy in your group begins to cough. It's dry at first, then wet, then red. His lips are cracked. His breath wheezes. He hasn't drunk in a day, maybe more. And the last melt pocket you found has dried up. The wind has changed. Even the moss is brittle. Panic rises. But instead of running, instead of searching wildly, you walk calmly. You return to the map you've built inside yourself. You remember the pile of hair bones at the northern ridge. You remember the frost-free patch near the cluster of gnarled brush. You remember where the birds bathed themselves in dirt weeks ago, their feathers puffed against the cold. You walk there. You test the soil with your palm. You feel it, dampness, subtle but there. You build a small fire. Let it smolder against the ground. Then you dig, slowly, methodically, where memory tells you the earth will give. And it does. Within the hour, you bring back water. Not clean, not perfect, but enough. The boy drinks, his mother weeps, no one speaks. Because they understand this isn't luck, this is something else. You've uncovered a system, a way of thinking that doesn't just react to the world but reads it, translates it, survives it. And though you may not call it science, though you may never write equations or name discoveries, you've done something few modern minds could replicate. You found water by reading death, by listening to plants, by trusting that the land leaves messages in places most people never think to look. But the question still haunts you. What signs do you still not see? What secrets lie beneath the clues you've only just begun to decode? And if this is just the beginning, how much more lies hidden, waiting to be read beneath the ice? You used to think the ground was just ground, hard, silent, frozen, an unyielding canvas underfoot, flat and dumb beneath the snow. You knew it by its texture, its resistance. You knew it by what it withheld, but you were wrong. Because the more you dig, the more you listen, the more you feel, the more you realize the earth isn't still, it's layered, alive. It breathes in a way that's just slower than you're used to, deeper, stranger. You don't have the word for it yet, but what you're standing on is permafrost, a vast, frozen body that's been building itself for tens of thousands of years. Not just cold earth, not just old ice, something more complicated. A labyrinth beneath your feet, laid down one winter at a time, like pages pressed into a sealed book that no one was ever meant to read. But you're reading it now. Each time your digging tool breaks the crust, each time your hands pull away frozen clumps of soil, you peel back another secret. And you start to notice the shifts not just in texture, but in temperature, resistance, even smell. One layer is sharp, brittle, dry. The next feels heavy, clay-thick, as if it remembers water. Then, lower still, there's a layer that smells of rot, a buried summer that never quite decayed, trapped forever in suspended animation. You start calling them by feel, the crust, the dense, the soft slick. But what you're actually touching are epochs, layers of glacial time. The topmost is seasonal frost, what the sun toys with before giving up. Below that is the active layer, the part that might thaw just enough to change before winter locks it again. But under that, deep and unforgiving, is the real gatekeeper, the permanent freeze. Permafrost. And this is where the game changes. Because permafrost isn't uniform, it isn't flat. It's a riddle disguised as soil. Somewhere in this matrix of frozen mud, ice lenses, and ancient moss, there are pockets, voids, chambers, tiny veins where pressure and time have done something miraculous. They've kept water liquid, trapped, compressed, warmed just enough by the heat of the earth itself, and sheltered from the sky's betrayal. You wouldn't believe it unless you felt it. The first time, you're not even sure what happened. You dig past the dry, the crunchy, the dense, and suddenly your tool sinks, just half an inch deeper than expected. But that shift, that softness, it sends a jolt through your spine. You lean in, you press your palm down into the hollow, and it's wet. Not flowing, not generous, but moist enough to bead on your fingertips, enough to breathe. You scrape a little more, and suddenly there's a trickle, brown, reluctant, but undeniably real. The earth is sweating, and you are witnessing it. You realize the permafrost isn't just a barrier, it's a vault, and sometimes, if you're patient, it leaks. But you can't just dig randomly. That's suicide. The frozen earth is dangerous. One wrong move and your pit collapses. Or worse, you break through into something unstable, a gas pocket, a slick mud core, an ancient cavity of thawed rot that releases a stench so sharp it makes your teeth ache. You're not just navigating cold, you're navigating the dead. Because frozen in this soil are things that never finish dying. Bison bones, mammoth marrow, buried forests, pollen that hasn't touched air in 30,000 years. It's all here, sleeping, waiting. And some part of you wonders, how many eyes have opened these chambers before you? How many hands once dug this same earth and didn't come back? Still, you learn. You learn that certain landforms betray the secrets beneath. Ground that rises into bulbous mounds, pingos, often hides pressurized ice cores. Cracked surfaces where the soil buckles in rings mean the freeze has shifted. Frost boils, soil hummocks, thermokarst sinks, all these strange deformities start speaking a new language to you. At first it's visual, then it becomes physical, then intuitive. You walk differently now. You listen to the crunch beneath your feet. Is it hollow? Is it tight? Is it new? You squat beside small ridges and tap them with bone. You press your nose to the snowpack to smell decay. You track warmth not by light but by moisture tension in the air. You're not looking for puddles anymore. You're hunting the feeling right before something melts. And then you start chasing the anomalies. Places where the earth steams faintly even in the cold, where insects gather in strange clumps, where you find twisted roots warped, swollen, oddly colored. All of it means change. All of it means thaw, not on the surface but beneath. That's what you're tracking now, invisible rivers sleeping deep, insulated by ages of ice and soil. But not all signs bring comfort. Because one day you dig too deep. You reach a zone where the earth pulses with warmth almost too fast. You think it's a miracle until the smell hits you. Sulfur, rot, something ancient and wrong. The air becomes thick. Your eyes sting. The others pull you out fast. You collapse choking, and when you look back, the ground bubbles slightly. Not water, not life. Methane. Something is waking in the deep frost, something older than any thirst you've ever known. And you begin to understand what this labyrinth truly is. Not just a source, not just a puzzle, it's a boundary. The permafrost holds water, yes, but it also holds carbon, gas, heat, memory. It is the Earth's ancient pantry sealed tight, until someone pries it open. You were digging for water, but now you see, you're not just a survivor, you're a trespasser. And the deeper you go, the more the ground resists, not physically, existentially. Because water isn't the only thing that's been waiting beneath this ice. And some truths were never meant to be thawed. At first you ignored them. You feared them, sure, any creature that moves silently through snow with teeth like that demands respect. But wolves were chaos, weren't they? Starving mouths on legs, hungry ghosts that stalked the edge of firelight. Nothing to learn from them, nothing to trust. That's what you thought until you started to watch. It began with a story. One of the old ones passed between frostbitten hands at the fire's edge, a tale of wolves that could smell water underground, not just snowmelt or streams, but hidden places under frost, under stone, places even your people hadn't dared to dig. You rolled your eyes then silently. Wolves finding water. It sounded like magic, folklore wrapped in desperation. But then the stories came back again. Different voices, different tribes, always the same core. The wolves find water. They always know where to go. And something inside you began to itch. So you began to pay attention, not to the stories but to the patterns. Because the wolves were starving, winter had tightened its grip early this year. You tracked a small pack near the southern edge of the hunting range. 4 bodies, thin and cautious. You watched them from a ridge for 3 days straight. They didn't move like desperate animals. They moved like pilgrims. They passed over kill zones, ignored trails rich with deer scent, circled a thawed carcass and kept walking. At first it made no sense, but then you realized they weren't hunting meat. Not yet. They were hunting water. At dusk on the 4th day they stopped in a shallow basin. Nothing visibly special, no stream, no spring, just brittle grass and layered frost. But the wolves began to dig, methodically, 2 at once taking turns. Dirt flew, snow scattered. After an hour, one of them licked the edge of the hole. Then again. Then drank. Your breath caught. You crept forward slowly once they were gone. The ground was torn up but not deep, just half a meter, maybe less. You touched the base with your fingers. Mud. And beneath it, damp stone. They had found a seep, a slow, underground leak feeding into a hollow none of your people had ever mapped. You didn't sleep that night. The next morning you picked up their trail again. And slowly something else became clear. This wasn't random. The wolves were tracing a path not linear but circuitous, a looping network of spots, each one within a day's range of the last. When you sketched it out in the dirt, it looked like a spiderweb of water memories, not just one source, a system. And something inside you shifted. What if the wolves weren't just lucky? What if they were remembering? You began to follow more packs. You stayed low, downwind, silent for days. You studied their gait, the pauses, the places they sniffed longer, the moments when their ears twitched toward the ground, not the sky. You watched them avoid areas where the ice was loud, brittle, unstable, and return, season after season, to places where the earth held weight, where they dug, where they drank. And you realized wolves weren't just predators, they were migrants of memory. They had no maps, no words, but they had lineage, learned behavior. Ancient instincts passed through generation after generation, not in thought but in motion. In paths walked by parents, mimicked by pups, traced in the land like invisible ink. They remembered water the way you remember fire, not as concept but as necessity. You started mapping their network. Every spot they lingered, every hollow they returned to. You scratched it into bone, into hide, into bark. And when your people saw what you were doing, they stared in silence. Because it matched. Your own crude records, the melt pockets, the damp moss beds, the frost-warped trees aligned with the wolves' roots, almost perfectly. You had built a science from death and roots, but they had carried it in their blood. And suddenly, the question wasn't, can you trust the wolves? It was, how could you not? But trust has limits. One morning, with your tribe desperate, you decided to follow a new pack north toward colder, stranger ground. You hoped they would lead to water no one else had found. You followed them for 6 days. No stops, no signs, only barren hills and wind-scoured silence. On the 7th day, one of the wolves collapsed. It didn't die immediately. It wheezed, struggled. The others didn't wait. That's when it hit you. Even they could fail. Their map was only as strong as memory, and memory in this world frays quickly. Too many bad seasons in a row, too much shifted ground, and even instinct falters. You buried the wolf, not because it meant something to you, but because it reminded you nature's wisdom is not perfect. It is just, less wrong than yours. You returned home, shaken but not broken. Because the lesson still holds. When you can't see the water, follow the ones who remember it, even if their remembering is wordless, even if it's flawed. The wolves walk old highways, through forest, frost, and fire, and some part of you knows your ancestors must have done the same. Long before you dug with tools, you followed tracks. You listened for howls. You let the animals lead. Because in a world where the sky betrays you and the ground hides its secrets, sometimes the most reliable guide is the hunger of another. But now a harder question forms in your mind. What if you followed them too far? What if one day they led you not to water but to something else, something hidden, something they returned to not for survival, but for ritual? And if that place exists, would you dare dig there? There comes a moment, after the wolves, after the frost, after the stories and the near starvations, when you stop wandering. You pick a place, you mark the ground, and you begin to dig. Not with guesses, not with hope, but with strategy. The idea seems absurd at first. You have no drills, no steel, no calibrated maps. Your tribe owns no wheels. Your tools were once ribs, antlers, stones smoothed by rivers long vanished. But still you dig. You build something from nothing. And without knowing it, you begin laying the foundation for an engineering science that won't get a name for 20,000 years. You just call it survival. The first rule you learn is this: heat is leverage. The ice won't yield to brute force, not for long. Even sharp stone cracks, even heavy bone splinters. The cold has patience, but you don't. So you shift your approach. You heat a stone in fire until it glows red, then plunge it into the top layer of frost. Steam shrieks into the night. The ground softens. You do it again and again, not fast but steady. The frost buckles, mud surfaces, and suddenly what was once an impenetrable vault becomes soft enough to shape. Others laugh at first. They say you're wasting fire. But when the pit begins to hold water just enough to cup in your hand, the laughter stops. What you've done is small, but it's repeatable. It's teachable. It's intentional. The second rule: go down in stages. You carve your pit not as a vertical drop, but as a layered spiral. Each level stabilizes the next. You shore it with slabs of permafrozen sod, braced with sharpened sticks, primitive cribbing that mimics structures future engineers will rediscover with machines. You press animal skins to the inner wall to slow refreezing. You build a gutter trench to divert runoff when thaw comes too quickly. You're inventing hydrological infrastructure. But to you, it's just logic, a memory of erosion reversed. Then comes the bone rod. A thin femur sharpened to a spike. You drive it into the deeper ice, twisting, listening. It vibrates differently depending on what lies beneath. A compact clay gives resistance. Loamy sediment sinks softly. If you strike trapped air, it whistles faintly. Hit mud and it pulls like a tongue. You begin to read the ground by texture and tone. Each dig becomes a form of percussion, a musical method of mapping the unknown. By now, your tribe no longer questions you. They bring you stone, wood, tusk. One person brings a hollow horn, which you use to channel melted water up from depth. Another suggests draping hide over the pit to preserve heat and slow evaporation. Someone else places crushed moss at the bottom. It absorbs sediment, purifies. It becomes communal, ritual. But it's also science. You begin to chart the depth of success. 10 hands deep gets you frost. 15 hands gets you seepage. 20 brings trickles or sometimes collapse. You record this not with numbers, but with notches in bark, patterns in beads, rings burned into wood. You are recording data. But this isn't mindless repetition, because you start experimenting. In one pit, you lay heated stones before digging, not after. In another, you use coals instead of flame. In a third, you try carving two adjacent shafts and connecting them, hopping for pressure. Sometimes you fail. Sometimes you lose a tool to collapse or find nothing but dead roots. But when it works, when water rises, pools, reflects light, the feeling is electric, not just relief, mastery. You realize something profound. Water doesn't just exist, it can be extracted, summoned. It isn't just something the earth gives. It's something you can coax from the ground if you learn how to ask. And in that asking, in those pits, those layered spirals, those smoke-stained tools, you're doing what no language yet names: hydrological engineering. No textbooks, no degrees, just fire, pressure, instinct, and patience. You begin sharing your methods with nearby groups. At first they doubt you, but then you dig for them just once, and when they see the water rise from what was once only dust and frost, they understand. Word spreads faster than fire. Soon other pits appear across the valleys. Some copy your style. Others innovate, deeper shafts lined with birch bark, melting chambers using animal fat, drip funnels warmed by coal beds. The ground, once feared, becomes a partner. You've done something that no tool could teach you. You've transformed the frozen earth into a resource, not a prison. And yet something stranger happens next. One evening, while examining a new dig site farther west, you discover something unexpected: a shaft. But it's old, too old. The edges are rounded, weathered. The spiral shape is familiar but not quite yours. The walls are reinforced with bones that don't match any animal you know. There are markings, abstract, scratched into stone, coated in mineral ash. You stare at it for a long time, because it means one thing. You weren't the first. Someone else, long before you, learned to dig for water. Someone without your tribe, your tools, your stories. But they understood. Maybe they found a way better than yours. Maybe they vanished before they could pass it on. And now you are echoing them, unknowingly repeating an ancient experiment across ages. You sit beside the shaft. You run your hand along the wall. The cold feels older than your breath, older than your language. You wonder what else is buried beneath your feet, not just water, but knowledge. Solutions lost. Technologies never recorded. You aren't just digging pits anymore. You're digging into deep time. And with each handful of earth, you uncover more than just moisture. You're unearthing the idea that human intelligence was never a straight line. That progress didn't begin with cities or wires or books. It began here, in the frost, in the mud, in the hands of people who refused to die thirsty. So tomorrow, you'll build another borehole. Not because you must, but because you can. And because now, when the sky offers nothing, you know how to make the ground speak. You were told nothing lived under the ice, nothing moved. But then one morning, after days of chipping, heating, sinking bone and stone and steam into the earth, you feel something change. Not just in the sound of the rod, not just in the way the shaft darkens. You feel it, a deep breath from below. And then the ground exhales. It starts as a whisper, a hollow softness beneath your digging stick. You twist and the resistance disappears. You push and it doesn't push back. You smell it before you see it, earth, old and wet and alive. Then it rises. A thin, slow shimmer up the shaft wall, warmer than the surrounding frost, clearer than any meltwater you've touched. This water flows. You don't cheer. Not yet. Something about it silences you. You dip your fingers into the rising pool. It's not just damp, it's moving. Actively, slowly, like something beneath is pushing. Not bubbling, not leaking. Flowing. It shouldn't be possible. You're under frozen land, beneath stone, beneath permafrost thick enough to choke trees. There is no river here. No surface melt, no rainfall, but the water keeps rising. Not much, just a slow, steady pulse. You cup it in your hands, it's warmer than expected. You drink, and you pause. Because you've just tasted something that should not exist. Thousands of generations later, people in white coats would call this subglacial hydrology, a phenomenon they once thought absurd. Liquid water under miles of ancient ice. How? By what mechanism? It defied everything they believed about pressure, freezing points, and terrain. But you don't know about freezing points. You know about persistence, about patterns, and about listening to the world more closely than it listens to you. The signs had been there. The dig site had a strange warmth to it, not heat, but an absence of cold. The way your digging stick came out wet, not frosted. The faint mist rising from the hole before sunrise. And there were stories of animals who returned to the same spot each winter, scratching at the same dead earth, long after rivers had vanished. You remembered the wolves. You remembered the basin where they dug not for prey but for hydration, and how, even in the depth of the coldest season, they never stopped coming back. It wasn't superstition. It was strategy. But this was different. This was not a surface spring. This was not a thawed puddle from yesterday's sun. This was water under pressure, hidden, preserved, flowing through veins no one saw under ice thicker than you are tall. It defies every rule you've learned about the land. And yet here it is. You dig a side tunnel to relieve pressure. It keeps coming. The flow isn't powerful, but it's steady, like something down there is melting from within or moving. That's the terrifying part, because you realize the ice above isn't dead, it's moving. Very slowly but moving, shifting, flexing, exhaling weight into the earth. You listen with your whole body. You feel it in your teeth. The ice is pressing heat downwards, and below it, the rock is pressing heat up. And in that crushing tension, between the freeze above and the fire below, something gives. Not explosively, not violently, just enough. Enough for water to stay liquid, enough for channels to form, enough for life even to linger. Because then you see something else. It's small, no bigger than a fingernail, caught in the muddy edge of the tunnel. Not a bone, not a rock. It wriggles briefly. You blink, you lean closer. It doesn't move again, but you could swear it did. You fish it out with a stick. It's soft, jelly-like. It breaks apart in the cold air, but it leaves a question behind. Was that alive? You stare at the water again. Suddenly, it doesn't look pure. It looks old, unfathomably old, preserved in darkness, in pressure, under layers of silence. What else is in there? You think of spirits, of old things sealed away, of the bones you've never dared to dig past. But you also think of something more primal, possibility. Because what you've touched, what now pools at the bottom of your hands, is a place between worlds, a liminal space where death and motion coexist, where pressure becomes warmth, where liquid survives where it shouldn't. And if water can flow here, what else is flowing? You feel something shift inside you. You look back toward your camp. You think of the others who will come, who will drink from what you've found. You've become something strange now, not just a digger, not just a survivor, but a messenger. Because this discovery changes everything. If there's water here under the oldest ice, beneath the most lifeless terrain, then nothing is truly barren. Not forever. You look at the shaft again. The walls are melting slightly. The ice is reshaping itself around your work. It's adapting. The earth is swallowing your discovery even as it gives it to you. That's the paradox. You can never truly possess this kind of water. You can only uncover it briefly, and then it disappears again. That's what makes it sacred. Tomorrow you'll return with others. You'll show them. Maybe they'll believe what they see. Maybe they won't believe it until they drink. But deep down they'll feel it too, that flicker of awe, of fear, of hope. Because this is no longer just about hydration. It's about something deeper, a message etched into ice and stone, a whisper from the belly of the earth. I am not done yet. And as you leave the dig site, one last thought follows you, quiet, steady, undeniable. If water flows here, what else is waking below? You think this place is yours because you found it, because your hands scraped it free from the frost, because the steam rose when you dug and the water touched your lips first. But then a shape, carved into a nearby stone, not by time or weather, intentionally, deep, deliberate lines that don't match the wind or the claw, a spiral or a map, or both. And suddenly you realize you weren't the first. Your fingers trace the carving. The grooves are worn smooth like they've been touched 1,000 times. And beneath the stone, half buried in frost, lies a shard of burnt bone, not fresh, ancient, scarred by fire, scored with notches. It's a message left in the language of necessity. The water you found wasn't new, it was remembered. You sit by the shaft in silence, the wind howling like it knows more than you. Around you, the cold seems less empty. You close your eyes and listen, not for sounds, but for intentions. You begin to hear it. Not words, not sentences, something deeper, a rhythm. It's in the way the wolves pace their return path every season. It's in the bends of the branches where someone once tied fiber to mark thaw lines. It's in the lullabies the elders sing to the youngest, which don't sound like warnings until you're old enough to decode them. They always said, "Where the stones weep, water waits. Where the lichen dies in circles, dig just west. When your breath rises straight, listen." You thought it was poetry. It was engineering. Oral survival culture is not stories for the firelight. It's technology. It's data compression encoded in chant and motion. You remember now the dance the elders made the children perform around the dry basin. The stomp-stomp pause turn, the whisper that followed. Bend here, dig low, wait long. As a child, it was just a game. As a digger, it becomes a map. You start remembering the chants differently now, not as decoration, but as documentation, protocol. Because writing here would never survive. Not on bark that rots, not on hides that flake, not on stones that sink beneath ice each winter, but memory moves, it walks, it sings, it lives inside other people's breath. You're part of something enormous, not a moment, but a river of recollection. The knowledge flows through you like the water beneath the ice. You don't own it, you channel it. And you wonder now, how much of what you know was taught to you not by words but by rhythm, by repeated muscle, shared gesture, glances, hesitations, songs that sounded like lullabies but were actually coordinates. Because now you see the web. This dig site connects to a trail of similar sites, places you passed without seeing. Each one marked subtly, an arrangement of bones that weren't for eating. A patch of ground scorched in a shape too deliberate to be an accident. A cairn that pointed not up but down. You understand now that the knowledge wasn't lost, it was transmitted. Kept alive not in paper or script, but in behavior. You inherited a dance you didn't know you were dancing. And as you trace your way back to the others, the song hums louder in your chest. You don't need to speak it aloud, you remember it in your bones. The pause between two drum beats. The shift in the elder's voice when they say, "Watch the sky before you walk." You realize memory in this place is its own survival. Somewhere far in the future, a scholar will marvel at how precise the oral cultures were. How these communities, without writing or math or GPS, knew how to locate subglacial water across vast, frozen terrains. They'll write papers about landscape songlines, about mnemonic topographies, about geocoded oral systems. But you just call it the way things are remembered. You don't need a word for it, you live it. And as you return to the fire, your hands raw from digging, your throat soot-stung from breathing steam all day, You feel it more clearly than ever. You are not alone. Not just because others surround you, not just because your clan depends on you, but because the knowledge you carry isn't yours. It came from before. It will go beyond. You are a link in a chain that stretches backward into the dark, 50,000 years long, and it hums with voices, not echoes of the dead, but instructions from the living who came before you. They whisper in the wind. They pulse in the earth. They carry forward in every child who sings the right note, at the right moment, in the right season. You were never digging alone. And that's what chills you the most. Not the cold, not the water, not even the mystery of what lies below, but the intimacy of inheritance. Because someone, thousands of years ago, stood where you're standing now, dug where you dug, heard the same strange silence when the water began to rise. And they left you a message. Not in writing, not in tools, but in the way you move, in the way you listen, in the song you thought you were singing for comfort but was actually a blueprint. You sit by the fire. The others look to you. You open your mouth and begin to pass it on. They never expected to find you, not here, not this deep in the frost-bitten vaults of time. But when the team of archaeologists lowers their scanners into the thawed pit, something catches an anomaly. The sediment is too disturbed, too purposeful, and the bones, they're not scattered as if by chance. They're arranged. Perfect arcs, circles inside circles, long bones placed like spokes on a wheel. The scientists freeze, tools half raised. This isn't natural. This is deliberate. This is memory preserved in silence. And they whisper, someone was trying to tell us something. You're long gone now, your breath turned to vapor centuries ago, your skin reclaimed by the earth. But what you left behind still speaks. And the message is not written in ink or stone. It's written in placement, in residue, in the haunting precision of a dig site that should not exist. Because this is not a grave. It's a map. They study the soil layers, the compacted ash pressed like a fingerprint between strata of permafrost. It shouldn't be there. Fire shouldn't have reached this deep, and yet it did methodically, repeatedly. Traces of charred wood and mineral-rich runoff stain the trench walls. A ring of thermally altered clay hints at ancient ingenuity. Someone wasn't just surviving here, they were engineering. But what confounds the modern mind isn't the evidence itself, it's the intent behind it. There are no written records, no blueprints, just bones and ash and shifted earth. Yet the patterns are undeniable, too consistent to be random, too structured to be instinct alone. They call it a hydrological anomaly, a curiosity, a dig site aligned suspiciously close to a known subglacial water channel. But some of them, the quiet ones, the ones who still believe that science needs humility, lean closer. They mutter to each other. They knew. They had to know. What they don't see is the way your fingers bled when you moved those bones. Not the first time was desperation. But the second time it was memory. Someone told you, mark this place, leave the long bones in a circle, sing the chant after sunset. Because if you don't, they'll forget. You'll forget. So you burned the fire just long enough to scar the dirt, just deep enough to leave the trace. You packed ash and ice into layers, hopping, praying that the melt patterns would tell the story. You never imagined satellites would one day pass overhead, that drones would buzz where wolves once howled, that someone in a clean lab coat would kneel in the same frozen soil and whisper the same quiet awe. There's water here. But somehow you knew it had to happen. You didn't preserve it for yourself. You preserved it for them. Later, the archaeologists debate whether it was a water shrine or a waste pit. Some say it was symbolic, some say utilitarian. They argue over dating methods and dig angles and thermodynamic plausibility. But deep down, the youngest one, the one who stays behind after the cameras pack up, the one who keeps brushing even when everyone else moves on, he feels it differently. He touches the central bone, a femur blackened and clean, and wonders who you were. He doesn't say it out loud, but something about the shape, the layout, the silence, feels too intimate to be coincidence. He wonders, could memory survive in structure? Could culture survive without script? Could intelligence leave behind more than tools? And the answer is right there beneath his hand. Because he isn't just touching bone. He's touching your decision. He's touching the moment you chose to encode survival. Thousands of years dissolve like breath on cold air, but the bones remain. Because bones remember what stories forget. They remember the angle of your wrist when you pressed them into frost. They remember the moment you looked back before walking away, unsure if anyone would ever see them again. They remember the silence after the water came when everyone drank and no one spoke. They remember why you marked the site, not out of pride, but out of obligation. Because you were not the first, and you would not be the last, and you knew that memory only lives if someone leaves it behind. So now, under fluorescent lamps and carbon dating sensors, your memory stirs, not in words but in recognition. They won't get everything right. They'll miss the meanings woven into the angles, the songs encoded into spatial rhythm. They'll call it ritual, because they don't yet have a better word. But a few of them will look longer, stay later, feel deeper. And they will say the one thing you hoped someone would say. They weren't guessing. You never call it writing. It doesn't feel like that. Not yet. It feels like remembering with your hands. Because when the cold tightens and your breath comes short and dry, you realize something terrible. Memory alone can be lost. Songs fade. Steps falter. Voices vanish in the wind. But a mark stays. If you carve deep enough, burn long enough, tie tight enough, someone will find it. So you begin to mark. Not just where the water is, but how it behaves, how it moves, how it rises after thaw and vanishes in wind. And because your people have no written language, you invent one, not from scratch, but from instinct, from need. A spiral means melt, a slash means ice too deep. 3 dots mean water that tastes sweet even after fire. You carve them into bone, into bark, into stone kept close to the body. These are not decorations. They are instructions, coordinates, warnings. Inside a cave mouth sealed half the year by snow, You kneel with a charcoal nub, sketching what the mind cannot always hold. You draw the hill's slope, the glacier's shoulder, the bend where water once roared but now whispers underground. You scratch grooves and arcs, match them to last season's discoveries. It doesn't look like a map, not the way the future will define one. But it is a map, a living, breathing one. One that only those who have felt the land will understand. Your symbols don't explain, they point. A curved line means, dig here but only after sunrise. A crisscross means, you must heat the ground before you attempt it. The layers of markings, some old, some yours, some older still, create something vast, something no single person owns. You're not just marking for you. You're speaking to the future in a language the future doesn't yet know it knows. And it's not just caves. You tie meaning into bundles of sticks. Each knot, each twist tells a story. One stiff reed curved around a brittle pine twig, shallow ice shelf, soft soil. Two bends bound together with sinew, danger of collapse, go slow. You carry them wrapped in fur, light enough to move with, strong enough to outlive seasons. They're dismissed later by the distant descendants of discovery as superstition. But these bundles are memory tools, tactile topographies, a way to feel the water paths even when your eyes fail, even when the storm blinds you, even when your voice breaks. Each one is a message for the one who comes after. Sometimes you make stone tokens, palm-sized, smooth on one side, scratched on the other. When you hold one, your thumb rests where another once did. The indentation isn't just for comfort, it's placement. It tells you which direction the glyph should face. It orients you, a compass made of memory. You trade them in silence with others who have walked long and deep. They nod when they feel the lines. They don't need explanations. Because this isn't about language, it's about water. And water doesn't wait for explanations. The younger ones begin to follow you. They mimic your gestures, copy your signs. Not perfectly, not yet, but the rhythm is there, the pattern, and that's what matters. Because you know now, you're not just finding water, you're building the world's first hydrological database. A system that lives in caves, bones, knots, and fire scars. That remembers not with text but with pattern, not with storage but with story. It will be millennia before anyone calls this science. Before scholars in climate-controlled labs scan these marks with lasers and write papers titled Protocartographic Communication in Paleolithic Eurasia. Before they realize these symbols weren't random, that they were recordings, precise, layered, intentional, that you weren't primitive, you were archiving. And still you hesitate sometimes. Will they see this? Will they understand? You imagine someone far in the future finding a cave blackened by soot, symbols half erased by wind and melt. Will they think it's art, religion, madness? Will they understand that you weren't trying to be remembered? You were trying to warn, to help, to guide, to pass something forward without ever knowing who would catch it. The day comes when you return to the cave and find a new mark beside yours. Not from your hand, not from your tribe. Another symbol, similar, not identical. Someone else out there is building, recording, mapping. And suddenly you know it's not just your memory that's spreading. It's ours. Human memory, species-level memory. The language of survival born without words, shared without meetings, spreading in the way only true necessity can. Not in conquest, in connection. This is how it begins. A notch on bone, a firemark on stone, a line in ash, a twist of reed, a dance, a hum, a map etched into the walls of a world half frozen and wholly alive. The water moves underground, and so do the stories, so do you. You carry them not in books, but in the way you look at the land. And when you leave a mark behind, you know what it means. It means someone will come, and they will be thirsty, and they will understand. You thought you'd won. You thought maybe this time the knowledge would hold. You carved the symbols, tracked the animals, mapped the melt. You sang the roots and marked the stones. You built a system, fragile, yes, but real. A way to survive, a way to remember. But then the ice shifted. Not all at once, not like a thunderclap, more like the way shadows lengthen across a valley, slow, creeping, patient. One day the cave entrance is harder to reach. Another, the stream that once whispered beneath your feet is silent. You press your ear to the ground, waiting for the hum, the gurgle. Nothing. You dig where the spiral marks told you, only frost. You return to the spring, where you once drank with trembling relief. Frozen solid. And that's when it hits you, not as a thought, but a sensation. The deep, stomach-sick knowing that what worked before no longer will. The ice has returned. And this time it is angrier. The elders don't speak of it, but they feel it too. In the stiffness of their joints, in the brittle snap of branches, in the hunger that comes too early before the migration. Children cry at night for water they can't name. Your mouth tastes of ash and doubt. Every ritual you trusted is now suspect. And so begins your second war. Not against thirst, you fought that battle. This is war against change itself. Because now you understand, the earth does not sit still. The ice remembers you just as much as you remember it. It adapts, encroaches, learns your paths and swallows them whole. The underground veins you once tapped are blocked. Pressure has shifted. Subglacial flows have frozen over or redirected miles away. The glaciers grind forward like giants with no eyes. The water retreats into locked vaults, hidden under new layers of permafrost. What was once a method has become a myth. And so you begin again. But this time the stakes feel sharper. There is no illusion of mastery. You know now knowledge must evolve or it dies. You are not the inheritor of a fixed truth. You are the steward of a moving target. You change how you read the animals. Not just where the wolves go, but how they hesitate, how long they linger. You notice new migration routes, fewer return paths. Even they are uncertain now. You test the ice differently, no longer assuming that last year's readings apply. You listen deeper, study new cracks, develop rituals of doubt, not certainty. Every decision is tempered by humility, and that humility keeps you alive. For a time. Some are not so lucky. One night you come across another tribe, starved, gray-lipped. They tried to dig, but in the wrong place. The fire collapsed the roof. Two children suffocated in steam. Their marks were based on outdated signs. Their symbols lied. Not because they were false, but because the world had changed underneath them. You kneel by their stone bundle. You recognize the code. It was yours once, passed through traders or wanderers or whispered in ceremony. But like all maps, it aged, became a fossil of the world as it was, not as it is. You burn their bundle, not out of disrespect, but as a warning. Old knowledge can kill. What do you do when the rules stop working? You invent again. Not out of ambition, out of desperation. You begin testing heat differently. You experiment with stacking embers between ice layers, slowly melting vertical cores instead of pits. You combine bone rods with sinew-twisted stone, creating pressure poles that punch through shallower glacial crusts. You try everything. You fail often. But the water does return, not always where you expect, not always enough, but enough to keep moving, enough to keep hope. And slowly, something inside you shifts. You stop thinking of this as a series of discoveries. You start seeing it as a dialogue, a negotiation with a living earth. The ice isn't your enemy. It's not cruel, just indifferent. And sometimes, when you learn to move with it instead of against it, it yields. You find shallow melt pockets not by digging, but by waiting, timing. You begin watching the color of the sky before sunrise. The faint shift from blue-gray to deep violet tells you more than any symbol ever could. It predicts how the ice will behave that day. A crack on the southern ridge becomes your new compass. A certain kind of moss, barely alive, signals unseen humidity. The signs evolve. So do you. There is no final victory. There is no one place, no single method that ends the hunger or the thirst forever. There is only vigilance. The realization that survival isn't about mastering the land, it's about attuning to it. Even your marks change now. You start adding slashes beside old spirals, not to replace them but to qualify them. To say, this was once true, it may still be, it may not. You're teaching the next finder not just what you knew, but how to question it. The ice takes what it wants, but it leaves clues. You're learning its language not by conquering it, but by enduring it. It retreats sometimes unexpectedly. A buried chamber collapses and out pours water brown and steaming, rich with minerals, almost sacred in its suddenness. You drink, you laugh, you remember. Then the ground shakes and you run. Because nothing is permanent. And that's the lesson. This isn't a one-time discovery. This is a lifelong war with ice. One fought not with weapons, but with awareness. You can't rely on what worked before, but you can remember how you learned it. And in that, you find the only thing more powerful than knowledge. Adaptation. You stare at the ground that refuses to yield. It's not just cold, it's armored. Frostbitten stone and earth fused into something closer to bone than soil. Your tools splinter, your hands bleed, and still the ice holds. So you stop hitting, and you start burning. At first, it's just instinct, the way you press your hands near a fire after the dig fails, the way you notice how even the hardest ground softens under heat. You recall the way animal carcasses sink into warmed snow, how embers leave hollow pits overnight. A question begins to glow at the edge of your desperation. What if the fire isn't just warmth? What if it's a key? You begin with caution. A small pile of coals near a digging site, nothing elaborate, the ground steams, the air thickens. When you return hours later, the frost has receded not far but enough to notice. The soil is darker, damp, touchable. You burn again, this time with intention. You place stones inside the fire, wait until they crackle and shimmer, and then drop them into the pit. You listen to the hiss, the shriek of thermal shock. The heat bites into the permafrost, and for the first time it bleeds. Water. Barely a mouthful, but it's there. What begins as an accident becomes an art. You begin stacking embers, shaping the heat like you once shaped stone. You learn that shallow fire pools melt too fast, they flood then freeze. But slow burns, fed carefully with dry roots and dung, create shafts, vertical tunnels of wet thaw that bore deeper each night. You wait, reheat, wait again. The shaft deepens. Every layer peeled away by fire reveals a new texture: ice crystal, sediment, buried grass, old animal hair. You begin to read the layers like stories, signs of ancient springtimes, collapsed dens. One day, a fragment of antler blackened by age, fossilized or preserved. The deeper you burn, the deeper the past rises up to meet you. But this is not easy work. It is exhausting, dangerous. Sometimes the shaft collapses, suffocating the fire and leaving you coughing, hands blackened, eyes stung. Sometimes the melt hits a pocket of gas or sap, and it flashes, a burst of flame that singes your hair and skin. You learn to wait outside the radius. You invent safety without numbing it. And slowly you gain control. You surround your shafts with rings of stone to contain the heat. You use wet moss to insulate the rim. You dig not with force but with time. And you realize you're no longer digging a hole. You're engineering a descent. You begin sharing the method, first with your kin, then with others. Around fire circles, you tell of the slow burn that opens the earth. Others try, some fail, some improve. One hunter adds crushed bone to the coals and swears it burns hotter. Another finds that dried fungus spreads the fire more evenly. The process mutates. It spreads. And soon, across the tundra, fire pits glow like stars in the dark. Each one a human heartbeat against the cold. You don't call it thermal drilling. You don't need to. For you, it's survival, ritual, a negotiation with the ground itself. But thousands of years later, a scientist with satellites and ice cores will find evidence of your burned shafts. The discoloration, the soot, the unusual sediment layers, and she will pause. Because this isn't natural. This is intentional. She will wonder, how did they know? How did they melt through ancient frost without metal? She won't know your name, but she'll know what you did. And maybe for a moment she'll feel close to you. Because here's the secret. You were never just trying to drink. You were trying to connect to something deeper than thirst, something closer to permanence. In a world of shifting glaciers and vanishing lakes, you needed one method that obeyed you, one practice that could be trusted, repeated, refined. Fire became that anchor. Not just warmth, not just light, but precision. You began to understand that water lives not where you wish, but where the ice permits. And fire is the language that negotiates with it. There are nights when you sit at the edge of a burned shaft, staring into the black steam, listening to the hiss of melting frost, and you feel something ancient looking back. You know now the earth is not solid, not fixed. It softens when you're patient. It listens when you speak its language. Fire, time, respect. That's your vocabulary now. And it leads you, once again, to life. But this is not the end of the journey. Because one day, you'll find something deeper than water. A chamber. An echo. Something the fire reveals that you never expected. You stop digging. Not because you're finished, not because you've failed, but because you hear something. You don't know what to call it. It's not a voice. Not quite. It's deeper, a presence, a texture beneath sound. And the more you strain to hear it, the more you realize it's not silence at all. It's signal. You kneel, press your ear to the earth. It's cold, still, but not dead. The world beneath you is moving. Not fast, not loud, but enough. A thud far off. A hollow reverberation. The subtle flecks of buried ice adjusting like the breath of something enormous in sleep. No one told you the ground could speak. Not in words, not even in signs, but you start to notice how it behaves when you walk across it, when you strike it, when you wait. You begin tapping. A stick, a stone, the butt of a spear. And then listening. Some spots echo, others absorb, some return a crisp knock, others give only a dull thud. Slowly, a map takes shape, not drawn, not marked, but heard. This isn't just soil. It's a layered body, and like any body, it responds when touched. You start tapping more deliberately. You walk in slow arcs, strike every few steps, listen with the bone of your jaw against the haft of your tool. You crouch low, press your hand flat to the frost, and feel for vibrations with your fingertips. And sometimes, in the right place, the echo changes. It widens, deepens. There's space down there, not open air, but something less dense, less resistant. You can feel it. Not with your eyes, not with logic, but with the part of you that has always known when the forest goes quiet before danger, when animals flee before the cold returns. That part of you is listening now. And it's learning to trust the ground. It becomes instinct. Long before you dig, you tap. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. You learn the tones of different grounds, sandy hollows, frozen peat, ice-bound clay. You learn the lies they tell, the tricks they play. You mark the places where the sound bends. And often, those places are wet beneath. Moisture changes everything. It slows the vibration, soaks the echo. A shallow puddle can silence a signal. A deep water table hums low and long like a drum buried beneath the world. You don't know the word seismology, but you know how the earth feels before it gives. And that's enough. Others notice what you're doing. They ask how you know where to dig. You say, I heard it. Some laugh, others try. Few succeed. It takes a patience that not all possess, a stillness, a kind of conversation. Because this isn't about force, it's about asking and being quiet long enough to hear the answer. You begin teaching your children not in words but in rhythm. You let them strike the ground. You tell them not like that, softer. Listen. And one day they pause after a tap, eyes wide. They heard it. You nod. The ritual is alive. Years later, someone else will find the remains of your tools. Stick-hafted stones worn smooth from repeated impact. Flat wooden discs placed carefully near ancient dig shafts. Even fire pits whose arrangement suggests sonic testing. Heated ground reacting to pressure with different resonance. The archaeologists won't be sure what they're seeing. But a few will wonder. Could they have heard the water? They'll run simulations, reconstruct soil densities. One will publish a paper that suggests early humans may have used primitive acoustic heuristics to detect voids and water pockets beneath the frost. Most will call it speculative. You'll call it obvious. Because once you learn to hear the ground, you can't unhear it. You start noticing everything: the creak before a landslide, the difference between an ice seam and frozen rock. You learn that certain cracks beneath your feet mean water pressure rising, that a faint gurgle deep below can mean melt runoff, a sign of spring, of life. The ground is not mute, it speaks, and you've learned to listen. And the more you listen, the more it teaches you. But sometimes it lies. A hollow echo that leads to dust. A sound that mimics water but reveals only gas or buried rot. Not every signal is true. Not every vibration is honest. But that doesn't make the method wrong. It makes the relationship real. You aren't listening to a machine. You're listening to a body. One that shifts, forgets, misleads, but never without reason. The mistake is not in the sound. It's in your interpretation. So you refine. You calibrate your ear to the land again and again. And slowly the misses become fewer, the hits more frequent. This is your new ritual. Tap, wait, listen. Choose your ground not with sight, but with intuition refined by repetition. You begin to know the difference between ice that will yield and ice that will fight, between soil that hides water and soil that only remembers it. And then, when the ground finally answers, when you tap and the sound drops into a tone so deep you feel it in your teeth, you smile because you've found it again. Water, beneath the frost, beneath the silence, not by force, but by listening. And the next time someone asks you how you knew where to dig, you'll tap the ground once and say, "It told me." And now beneath your feet something shifts again, louder this time, a new signal deeper than all the rest. You're not just hearing water anymore, you're hearing motion, pressure, something waking up. You wrap yourself in the hide of something long dead, not just for warmth, not just for protection, but because it means something. The lines etched into the leather by tooth, by claw, by your own sharp stone aren't decoration. They're direction. You just don't say that aloud. Because no one in your camp uses the word map. No one says data. You don't write equations, don't draft charts. But that doesn't mean you're not recording, remembering, translating experience into something lasting. The truth is, every surface you touch becomes a canvas. Every object carries more than just its function. It carries a message. You notice that some pelts wear differently, that certain creases in the hide appear only after long journeys to known water sources, that the bloodlines in reindeer legs run different shades depending on the terrain they've crossed. These things embed themselves in the skin. And over time, you stop seeing it as just fur, just clothing. You start reading it. You look to the lines in your mother's stitched coat, the places where sinew frayed, where fur thinned near the belly. That was the journey north, the trek across the dry ridge, the winter of no melt. You inherited her skin and her memory. Later, you begin marking them intentionally. You carve ridges across tanned leather where rivers once ran. You stitch bone beads into patterns that mimic the zigzagging paths of wolves toward thawing plains. Your cloak becomes a hydrological timeline. And when you kneel at the fire, others study it as they listen to you speak. They don't ask where to find water. They touch the lines on your shoulder and trace them in the air. And they remember. Your culture becomes a living manual. But it hides in plain sight. The stories you tell are about spirits, yes, but they are also about soil, about watching the way a mammoth kneels before sleep, about the creaking of ice that signals trapped warmth beneath, about the god who drinks from underground springs and only visits during certain moons. They're parables, but they're also precise. And in your dances there is rhythm but also root. Steps mimic distances, turns mark direction, whole migrations encoded into ceremony. You don't teach your children where the water is. You teach them the song, and let their feet remember the path. And when a child asks about the shell bead around your neck, the one shaped like a spiral, smooth as glass, you don't say, "This means there was water here." You say, "This keeps the spring in my memory." And they nod, because they've heard the same phrase said 100 ways before, on different beads, on different days, and each one points to a place, a moment, a flood or a drought or a hole in the ice that once gave life. These aren't metaphors. They're coordinates. The hides you wear are maps. The songs you hum are records. The objects you pass down are code. But none of it looks like science. Not to the strangers who will find it one day under ash, under stone, buried in frozen graves. They'll lift your clothing and call it art. They'll catalog it in museums, describe the beads as decorative, the carvings as ritualistic. They won't see what you see. They won't know that every mark in that leather once guided someone to drink. They won't realize that the fur still smells like survival. unless they learn to read again. Because buried beneath language, beneath symbols and myth and motion, is something you never lost: pattern recognition. You knew intuitively that culture had to carry memory, not just memory of ancestors, but memory of how to live. And so you embedded it in the things you touched, the tools you made, the stories you whispered to the next generation before sleep. Culture became your library. Not shelves, not pages, but skin, bone, smoke, song. A decentralized archive, always moving, always worn. And inside that archive, instructions, warnings, clues. For those wise enough to feel what's been stitched between the lines. Even the animal you hunted became teachers. You noticed that some hides dried faster, that others retained moisture longer, that a moose hide from the eastern ridge always came from a wetter region, and if it was dry this year, something was wrong. You didn't just wear your kills. You studied them. Used them like a barometer, a report. Your cloak told you where the water used to be. Your belt told you how far it had moved. Your satchel, decorated with the teeth of a fish that once swam through meltwater channels, reminded you of what's been lost and what might return. This is what your descendants may never fully understand: that your survival wasn't luck. It was encoded. In language, in leather, in lineage. Your systems of knowledge weren't primitive. They were flexible, sensory, decentralized, passed through skin-to-skin contact and memorized in rhythm. They were designed not to be stored in buildings, but in bodies. Because buildings crumble. But culture walks. And it walks wrapped in hide, humming the path to water. One day, thousands of years from now, a child might hold your carved bone needle and marvel at the markings. They won't know what it meant to you. They won't know how many lives it stitched back together during winters of thirst. Unless someone teaches them how to listen. Not just with the mind, but with the memory carried in hands. The wisdom worn on backs. The message braided into fur. The message that still whispers. Here, dig here, drink here, live here. But even culture has limits. Even memory can fade. And ahead lies something no story has prepared you for. The first time the old ways fail. The next chapter begins not in strength, but in forgetting. They call it an achievement, a marvel, a breakthrough. As their steel drills sink into polar silence, spinning deeper into time itself, they claim to discover what was always there. But you knew. Not in the language of isotopes or climate models, not with computers or coring rigs, but in breath and bone, in the color of the wind and the taste of the snow. You didn't need a laboratory to feel what the world was becoming. You lived inside the forecast, and it screamed through your skin. The scientists call them ice cores, long crystalline cylinders drawn from the frozen veins of ancient glaciers. To them, each layer is a revelation. They read years like pages, counting volcanic eruptions by ash flecks, tracing droughts through deuterium signatures. They see CO2 levels trapped in air bubbles and sketch the curve of collapse. And what they find is astonishing. They see abrupt warming, flash freezes, Dust storms that carried halfway across the planet. Centuries of silence followed by a sudden thaw. They stare into the ice and see chaos, violence, unpredictability. And they wonder, how did anyone survive this? They don't understand that you already had. You didn't need their graphs. You had your own oracle. It lived in instinct, in memory, in the ripple of animal migrations, in the lean of trees twisted by frostbite, in the strange stillness before a melt. You could feel when the air shifted, not just temperature but something deeper, the mood of the world. When the snow crusted differently beneath your feet, you knew something had changed. When the moss bloomed on the wrong side of the stone, you listened, not with ears, with presence. Because survival wasn't just about finding water or warmth. It was about learning the rhythm of the glacier, the way it breathed in centuries and exhaled catastrophe. The ice did not move quickly, but it moved with purpose. And you watched. You watched how the ice swallowed valleys, how rivers shifted course without warning, how entire hunting grounds became tombs of silence. You didn't measure the years. You measured the stories. You became fluent in entropy. And where modern scientists drill through 10,000 frozen winters to extract meaning, you once sat in the snow and felt it speak. They wonder how your kind knew when to leave, how you crossed mountains before the storms collapsed them, how you found the new watering hole days before the old one turned to dust, how you built your shelters not just for now, but for what was coming. To them it looks like myth, like coincidence. But to you it was neither. It was a knowing, a pattern recognition so old it had no name. It hummed in your gut. It kept your children alive. And it warned you quietly when the ice was about to bite back. Now in sterile labs thousands of miles from where you once walked, they hold your future in frozen tubes. They shave layers of ice into slides, peer into microscopes, whisper about ppm, anomalies, and timelines. They speak as if they've unlocked the wisdom of the past. But they're only now catching up to what you knew by starlight and silence. They call the deepest core the Rosetta Stone of climate. And yes, it tells stories. It shows ancient fires, shifts in wind belts, the breath of the earth itself frozen in place. But there is one thing it cannot show. That someone was already listening. You were that someone. You were the glacial oracle before the term existed, the human barometer. You didn't use language like El Niño or thermohaline circulation, but you knew when the fish wouldn't return. You didn't say precipitation anomaly, but you knew the snow would fall heavy this season, heavy enough to bury even the memory of the trail. You weren't guessing. You were remembering. Because your oracle wasn't a single person or a prophet, it was collective, it was cultural, passed from grandmother to child to wanderer to hunter. An algorithm not of numbers, but of stories. That's what the scientists miss. They see your bones and your tools and think they are peering into your knowledge, but they are only touching the residue. Your real knowledge moved in the way your people migrated. In the seasons you broke camp. In the rituals you repeated not because they were sacred, but because they worked. Because they timed you to the pulse of the planet. They think they've uncovered the great mystery, how humans endured the swings of ice age volatility. But they're still asking the wrong question. The question is, how did they survive? It's how did they already know? And if they could ask you, if they could place their gloved hands on your shoulder and look you in the eyes and say, how did you predict all this? What would you say? You might tell them the story of the wind that never stopped howling, of the wolves that vanished 3 days before the river cracked, of the mountain that sang at night before the avalanche came. You might whisper of the sound the earth made when the permafrost groaned, of the strange taste in the air that arrived just before every great change. You wouldn't call it data, but it was. You wouldn't call it a forecast, but it was. And in that moment, they'd see the truth, that their great, gleaming ice cores are not the beginning of understanding. They are confirmation of something ancient, of something buried, of you, because long before science named it climate, you called it sky mood, earth memory, glacier wisdom. And you didn't just survive it. You interpreted it. You moved with it. You became it. Now, as their drills pierce deeper, reaching ice that has not seen light in 1 million years, they get closer to you, closer to the moment your world cracked, to the final drought, to the great migration, to the place where your memory left fingerprints in the sediment. And still they will ask, who taught them how to survive this? And still the answer will rise, silent, cold, and impossibly clear. You did, because you were the oracle. And the glacier remembered, but not before you did. And still the ice speaks, still it shifts, and ahead of you in the silence beyond memory waits a moment no one, not even you, could fully prepare for. You used to think of water as a gift, a quiet salvation buried in ice, something precious, elusive, something worth crawling for, digging for, risking everything to reach. But then it changes. It stops whispering, stops hiding. One day it roars. It starts with a sound you can't name, not thunder, not wind, not the groan of trees. It comes from below, a pressure rising, a silence that breaks its own ribs. You feel it in the soles of your feet before you hear it. A low, guttural shudder that turns the ground into breath. Then the ice beneath you fractures, and the water comes. It doesn't trickle or seep or wait for your hands to reach it. It erupts. It erupts. What had once been frozen and entombed for centuries tears through the earth like it remembers what you forgot. It is stronger than you. This isn't a spring. It's a purge. A subglacial flood, what the future will call a Yerkolop. But you have no word for it. Only the aftermath. Broken shelters, drowned embers, vanishing tools swept away in a wall of mud and meltwater. You watch everything you carried disappear into a river that wasn't there yesterday. You thought water was life. Now you learn that it's also death. And it doesn't come just once. You learn to listen for the signs, a sharp stillness, a tightening of the air, the birds that vanish a day too soon, the earth bulging slightly in places where it should not move. You learn what it means when the ice quakes beneath you. Not just cracks, but deep, wrenching spasms from below, as though something ancient is shifting, awake and angry. What you once called solid ground becomes unpredictable. What you once trusted, the silence of the glacier, becomes the threat. Because the ice holds water, and water remembers the path out. Sometimes it bursts through without warning. Other times you see it swelling beneath seams of darkened snow, under rocks that no longer sit still. You try to flee. Sometimes you make it. Sometimes others don't. You bury them with the same water they once worshipped. You mark the ground not with symbols of bounty but with warnings. Do not return. Not here. Not again. The elders begin to tell a new kind of story, not one of finding water, but surviving its wrath. You pass these tales through firelight and gesture. Children grow up knowing both reverence and fear. Because now you understand something most won't grasp for millennia. Water isn't passive. It waits. And when it comes back, it comes with memory and momentum. Later, the scientists will find these scars, deep gashes beneath ancient ice sheets, twisted riverbeds buried far from where rivers should be. They'll argue over how they formed. Some will say it took thousands of years. But you know better. It took a moment, one violent release, one scream from beneath the ice, one failure in pressure. And the flood remembered its way through stone. You start moving differently, sleeping differently. Your camp never stays in one place too long. You study not just the sky or the moss or the animals, but the ice itself. You learn to see its stress fractures. You trace veins of potential failure. You treat it like a living thing, because it is. It groans when it's full, it tightens when it's ready, and beneath it the water churns. Always moving, always watching, waiting. There are stories now, stories no one likes to tell but everyone needs to hear, of entire hunting parties swallowed by sudden floodwaters, of a cave that collapsed the day after its walls began to sweat, of a lake that rose overnight and boiled away the following week, leaving nothing but bones and driftwood. You carry these stories in your bones, and you begin to change the way you dig. Now you dig higher in safer ground. Now you test the melt rate before stepping forward. Now you build not just for access, but for retreat. Because you have learned the ice is not neutral. It is not only keeper. It is gatekeeper. And sometimes it opens the door too wide. But it's not all terror. From the destruction, you begin to understand something deeper, something few civilizations will fully grasp. That nature doesn't punish. It balances. That the same water that kills can guide you if you know how to listen. If you learn its patterns, not just its promises. If you stop treating it like a tool and start respecting it like a force. You've started to see it for what it really is. A memory that moves. A river that remembers its shape, even when buried in centuries of silence. A teacher. And so you become more cautious, yes, but also more skilled. You use the flood paths to map safer zones. You time your movements to pressure changes. You read frost not just for direction, but for warnings. And when the next quake comes, and it always comes, you're ready. You lose less. You mourn less. And you realize something strange. You've stopped fearing the water. You've started listening to it. The next generation will never know what it felt like the first time the ground betrayed you, but they will know the rituals you taught them, the tests, the signs. They will call it instinct, luck, animal wisdom. But it's not. It's experience carved into culture. And long after you are gone, when the ice shakes and the rivers rise again, they will step back instead of forward. They will wait. They will survive. Because you taught them that when the water fights back, you don't fight it. You move with it. You honor it. You prepare. And in doing so, you earn your place. Not above the earth, but inside its rhythm. Still, not all dangers lie beneath, because above you now, gathering, shifting, breaking in slow, ancient rhythm, is something vaster than water, something that falls, not flows, something heavy and white and capable of erasing everything you've ever known. You wouldn't recognize the world today. Steel towers rising where mammoths once wandered, roads slicing through ancient migration paths, satellites overhead watching the Earth from space, counting moisture by wavelength, mapping water tables in pixels and code. They say nothing is hidden anymore. But they're wrong. Because they still don't see what you saw, not with your feet, your breath, your skin. They have data. You had something older. You had instinct, memory, pattern, and you were right more often than they are. They pour concrete over land you would never have touched, build cities on floodplains you learned to flee, dig where the soil feels wrong, even before the water rises to punish the arrogance. They call you primitive. They don't know the language you left behind, not in words, but in placement, rhythm, restraint. They don't see the caution in your choices, the knowledge behind where you didn't build. Because you knew that where water sleeps, it wakes, and where the ground is too quiet, it remembers how to scream. Now, millennia later, they find your marks, buried under meters of ice or hidden in sediment like time capsules. They think it's coincidence when your dig sites align with modern aquifers. They call it curious that your cave symbols sit above underground lakes. They say strange, they couldn't have known. But you did. You felt it. You pressed your palm to the soil and listened for vibration. You followed the arc of birds in migration. You watched how moss grew in sunless corners and how frost clung differently to certain stones. You tracked the changes not in decades, but in lifetimes. What you left behind wasn't accidental. It was hydrology, written not in paper but in life. Modern scientists still argue about how early humans survived during the deepest freezes of the Ice Age. They call it a miracle, a mystery, a statistical outlier in human resilience. But they never look closely enough. They never ask how you knew. Not just to dig, but where. Not just to gather water, but when. Not just to survive, but to teach it forward. They dismiss the idea that knowledge could live in dance, or drumbeat, or the curve of an animal bone laid just so near a melted pit. They call it superstition. You called it survival. And slowly, they're beginning to understand the difference. Because one by one they begin to stumble across the remnants, in Siberia, in Alaska, in the high Arctic. Bone rods aligned to melt paths, charred soil layers precisely placed above frost lines, ash mixed with sand in ratios designed to insulate pits, symbol clusters that, when mapped, form grids over known freshwater deposits. And still, they hesitate to believe. It would mean rewriting what they think they know about you, about what it means to be advanced. They were taught that history is a ladder, primitive to complex, unknowing to knowing, darkness to light. But your truth is circular. Knowledge rises and falls with the ice. And sometimes, in the hush between discoveries, they wonder, just for a moment, whether progress blinded them, whether the earth once whispered louder and we simply stopped listening. They scan with LiDAR, and sometimes, beneath cities and motorways, they find traces of old footpaths, paths you etched, not with intent to be remembered, but with the memory of water in your bones. You didn't need to know what a glacier was made of to respect its hunger. You didn't need to measure aquifers to follow the thirst of wolves. You didn't need maps, because your body was a map, carved by generation after generation of watching the land breathe. And still today, in labs with blinking lights and million-dollar machines, they chase the secrets you once carried in silence. Now, some of them are starting to ask different questions. They return to your fire pits, your cave etchings, your artifacts not as relics but as instructions. They realize that survival wasn't a lucky accident. It was deliberate, tested, inherited. Your life was a running experiment in what water remembers and what humans can learn if they slow down enough to feel. You weren't guessing. You were observing. You weren't wandering. You were mapping. Not in symbols they recognize, but in decisions. And those decisions, where to stop, where to dig, where to run, outlived you. They're still here, just buried. You wouldn't call yourself a scientist, but you worked with hypotheses. Where do birds circle in the drought? Why does frost vanish near a fallen tree? How deep must the fire burn before the ground softens? You tested, you adapted, you recorded. You failed. You learned. And the evidence is everywhere if anyone cares to look closely enough, not just at the objects, but at their placement, their context, their rhythm. You didn't separate survival from knowledge. They were the same thing. And now, the world is beginning to wake to what that means. You, the barefoot cartographer. You, the frost-literate engineer. You, the unnamed hydrologist. Your maps weren't printed. Your data wasn't digital. But your accuracy, it may have been better than ours. Because some knowledge isn't visible from above. Some wisdom is buried, not lost. It sleeps in the dirt, in the ash, in the soft grooves left by a stick dragged across permafrost with purpose. And when the earth shifts again, when the next great freeze comes, or the water rises too fast, we may find ourselves needing your memory, your humility, Your eyes. But there's still one thing you saw and understood that no sensor, no supercomputer, no artificial intelligence has grasped yet. Water isn't a thing to be controlled. It's a relationship to be kept. One that begins not with knowing, but with listening. And that's where this ends, or perhaps begins again. One final mystery still lingers. How did you know without seeing? How did you feel the water move before it moved? In the next and final chapter, you'll step fully into the deep time of instinct and uncover the part of you that never forgot. You like to think you're modern, that you live above the past, that stone tools and fire pits belong to some distant chapter, a separate species, a forgotten mind. But that's the lie you were sold, because the Ice Age never left you. It waits beneath your thoughts, humming quietly in your spine, your breath, your skin's recoil in cold air. That instinct to check the sky before stepping outside, to glance behind when walking alone, to know something is wrong before you can explain why. That's not modern anxiety, that's memory, inherited, ancient, yours. You are the descendant of survivors, people who lived in a world where forgetting meant death, where a single misstep could freeze your children, where every shape on the horizon was predator or prey, and water, just water, was a question of life or extinction. And the ones who didn't listen, they're not your ancestors. Your mind was never built for algorithms. It was built to read wind, to hear silence, to feel vibration beneath your feet and know it means something, even if you can't name it, even if science hasn't caught up yet. You've just forgotten how to trust that part of yourself. You were trained to ignore it, to silence it, told to rely on numbers, screens, models. But when those systems fail, when the pipes run dry, when the satellites miss the signs, what will guide you? You already know the answer. You always did. The question is, can you remember fast enough? Because the world is changing again. Water is vanishing, flooding, turning on us. The rain doesn't come when it should. Rivers retreat. Reservoirs crack. And for all our technology, we're still surprised, still scrambling. But what if this isn't new? What if the knowledge for what comes next is already inside you? You were never separate from your ancestors. Not in bone, not in brain. Their decisions shape the folds of your mind, the tilt of your perception, the rhythm of your heart under stress. And now, as drought spreads, as glaciers melt into chaos and the ground forgets how to hold water, your ancient mind starts to stir. Not with panic, with recognition. You start noticing again that certain trees look healthier than others, even in dry spells, that animals cluster near places they didn't before, that the air feels wrong before the flood hits. You stop checking the forecast and start feeling the wind. You begin listening with your skin. You hear water long before you see it. You understand not with proof but with presence that something old is waking in you, a part that was never lost, only buried. Like all the best things are. Modern life has trained you to doubt instinct, to need evidence before action. But your ancestors lived by a different law. If the birds fly early, move. If the frost returns too soon, store more. If the wolves vanish, water is not far behind. They didn't need instruments. They were the instrument. And so are you. You feel it when you walk into a room and something shifts, not in noise but in pattern. You sense it when your body reacts before your mind does. That's not paranoia. That's the echo of your Ice Age mind. It's trying to protect you. But the question isn't just whether you'll listen. It's whether you'll practice. Because instinct without attention is like fire without fuel, it fades. But if you lean into it, it sharpens. Like stone on stone. You begin small, spending time in silence, watching the land not for beauty but for meaning, noticing how shadows fall across hillsides, where animals pause to drink, how fog gathers in familiar curves. You begin remembering not facts but feelings, where the ground felt hollow beneath your feet, where the air grew dense before a storm, where stories once whispered, "Don't camp here." This isn't nostalgia. It's reactivation. Because survival wasn't a trick. It was a skill, honed, practiced, passed. And the practice was not just external. It shaped internal biology. Neural grooves etched with the rhythm of caution, curiosity, and adaptation. And as you begin to remember, you begin to change. You stop needing certainty to act. You start trusting patterns your eyes alone can't see. You listen when something feels off. You move when silence deepens too quickly. You prepare not from fear, but from knowing. And in this remembering, you're not alone. Others begin to sense it too, that their ancestors weren't blind wanderers, that the earth was once read like a book, not through numbers, but through experience. They start to realize that beneath every high-tech survival strategy is a foundation that was laid in fur and ash and ice. They feel their own Ice Age minds waking. And together, something shifts. Maybe the future isn't just about smarter machines. Maybe it's about smarter memory. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as continuity. You don't need to return to the cave. But you do need to remember what the cave taught you. That survival is not separation from nature, it's participation in it. That intelligence is not just innovation, it's attention. And that water is not a resource. It's a relationship. So as the modern world tightens, as cities dry and rivers twist into strange new shapes, you begin to do something radical. You stop searching outward for answers. And instead, you look inward. To the voice that once told you, "The wolves know the way. The bones hold the map. The earth will speak if you still yourself long enough to listen." That voice is older than language. And it is still speaking. You just have to remember the sound. Because the Ice Age never ended. It just moved inside you, waiting for the moment when the world would need its wisdom again. And that moment is now.